Dr. Alexander Mitchell stood at the lectern of Harvard University's largest auditorium, his perfectly tailored suit and commanding presence drawing all eyes to him. At 52, he was one of the most respected professors in behavioral psychology, known as much for his groundbreaking research as for his unapproachable demeanor. His salt and pepper hair and stern expression had earned him the nickname the Iron Professor among his students. The autumn morning light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the lecture hall as he surveyed the sea of eager faces before him. This was his advanced seminar in cognitive behavioral research, and only the most promising students had earned a place here. Yet something was different today, a disturbance in his perfectly ordered world. In the third row, a young woman he didn't recognize sat with a stack of worn notebooks, her attention fixed on him with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Unlike the other students in their expensive clothes and latest technology, she wore a simple sweater that had seen better days, and her notes were written in pencil rather than typed on a laptop. "The human mind," he began, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room, "is not simply a collection of thoughts and memories. It's a complex network of patterns, behaviors, and adaptations that we're only beginning to understand. Today, we'll discuss the latest developments in cognitive restructuring and its implications for treating resistant depression." As he spoke, he noticed the young woman's hand shoot up, something that rarely happened during his lectures. Students knew better than to interrupt him. With a slight frown, he nodded in her direction. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and confident despite the whispers her interruption had sparked, "your recent paper on cognitive restructuring techniques suggests that traditional methods might actually reinforce negative thought patterns in certain cases. But what if we're approaching it from the wrong angle entirely?" The auditorium fell silent. No one challenged Dr. Mitchell's theories, especially not in his own classroom. He fixed her with a stern gaze, prepared to deliver one of his famously cutting responses, but something in her expression gave him pause. There was no defiance in her eyes, only genuine intellectual curiosity and something else he couldn't quite identify. "An interesting observation, Miss Sarah Chen, sir. I'm auditing your class through the Community Outreach Program." Ah, that explained her presence. The university's new initiative to allow qualified local students to audit classes had been controversial, particularly among the faculty who preferred their elite status quo. Alexander had opposed it himself, seeing it as a dilution of academic standards. "And what makes you think we're approaching it from the wrong angle, Miss Chen?" he asked, genuine curiosity creeping into his voice despite his initial irritation. Sarah stood, clutching her notebook. "Your own data shows a correlation between traditional cognitive restructuring and increased anxiety in patients with complex trauma histories. What if, instead of trying to reshape existing thought patterns, we focused on creating new neural pathways altogether? I've been working on a theory." For the next few minutes, Sarah outlined an approach that made Alexander's heart race with academic excitement. Her ideas were rough, unpolished, but there was brilliance in them, a fresh perspective he hadn't encountered in years of academic discourse. The bell rang, interrupting her mid-sentence. Students began gathering their things, but Alexander barely noticed. His mind was already racing with the implications of Sarah's theory. As the auditorium emptied, he found himself walking toward her as she packed up her worn notebooks. "Miss Chen, a moment of your time." She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of too much coffee and too little sleep. She looked exhausted, yet her eyes remained bright with intellectual fire. "Your theory. It's unconventional, but it has merit. Would you be interested in discussing it further, perhaps over coffee?" The words left his mouth before he could consider their implications. He never socialized with students, never engaged with them outside of strictly academic settings, yet here he was, inviting this unlikely student to coffee. Sarah hesitated, clutching her notebooks closer. I actually have to get to work. I'm on a tight schedule between my jobs and classes. Jobs? Plural? She nodded, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. 3, actually. The coffee shop down the street in the mornings, data entry at the hospital in the afternoons, and waitressing at night. It's the only way I can afford to audit classes here. Alexander felt something shift inside him, a crack in the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his academic life. This young woman, working 3 jobs just to attend his class as an auditor, had produced more innovative ideas in one interruption than he'd heard from his full-time students in years. Or what if I could offer you something better? A research assistant position in my department. The words surprised them both. Research assistants were typically chosen from the top PhD candidates, not community auditors. But as soon as he said it, Alexander knew it was right. Her fresh perspective, combined with his experience and resources, could lead to breakthrough discoveries in their field. Sarah's eyes widened, hope warring with suspicion on her face. Why would you offer that to someone like me? Because, Miss Chen, true brilliance doesn't come with a price tag or a pedigree. It comes from seeing what others have missed. And you've just demonstrated that ability in spectacular fashion. She stood straighter, her exhaustion seemingly forgotten. I wouldn't want any special treatment, Dr. Mitchell. If I accept, it would have to be based solely on merit. He found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like years. Of course, I wouldn't have it any other way. Shall we discuss the details tomorrow, say 9 a.m. in my office? As Sarah nodded and hurried out of the auditorium, Alexander remained standing there, surrounded by empty seats and the lingering excitement of discovery. He had built his career on understanding human behavior, yet he couldn't quite explain why this encounter left him feeling so unsettled, so alive. What he couldn't know, was that this moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about academia, about class barriers, and about himself. Sarah Chen, with her worn notebooks and brilliant mind, was about to turn his carefully ordered world upside down, and nothing would ever be the same. Can love overcome social barriers and prejudices? Don't miss a moment of this story that will make you believe in the true miracles of the heart. The next morning, Alexander found himself straightening his tie for the 3rd time as he waited in his office. The mahogany-paneled room, filled with leather-bound books and academic accolades, had always been his sanctuary. Today, it felt oddly constraining. The autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. And for the first time, he noticed how the room might appear to an outsider, intimidating, perhaps even ostentatious. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Chen entered, looking even more exhausted than yesterday, but somehow more determined. She'd attempted to dress more formally, wearing a blazer that was slightly too large for her frame, likely second-hand. The sight stirred something unexpected in Alexander, not pity, but a profound respect for her dignity in the face of obvious hardship. Please sit, he gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. As she settled in, he noticed her taking in the room, her eyes lingering on the numerous awards and certificates that lined the walls. I've drawn up a preliminary contract for the research assistant position. The university typically requires enrolled students for such roles, but I've spoken with the department head about making an exception. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. You've already arranged this, but you hardly know me or my work. I know enough, Alexander replied, sliding the contract across his desk. Your intervention yesterday demonstrated not just intelligence, but innovation. That's rare in academia. Rarer than you might think. As Sarah began reading the contract, Alexander found himself studying her face. There was something fascinating about the way her expression shifted as she processed information. Subtle micro-expressions that betrayed a mind working at remarkable speed. This is very generous, she said finally, looking up with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Almost too generous. What's the catch, Dr. Mitchell? He leaned back in his chair, appreciating her directness. The catch, as you put it, is that I expect complete dedication to this research. You'll need to quit your other jobs. This position will provide enough to cover your basic needs, and more importantly, it will give you the time and resources to develop your theories properly. Sarah's face fell slightly. I can't quit my jobs, Dr. Mitchell. I have obligations. What could be more important than pursuing groundbreaking research? This is an opportunity that most people would dream of. She hesitated, then straightened in her chair. My mother is sick. The jobs aren't just for me. They help pay for her medical bills. The hospital's data entry position provides health insurance that covers part of her treatment. I can't give that up, even for this opportunity. Alexander felt the floor shift beneath his perfectly ordered world. He'd assumed her multiple jobs were simply about supporting herself through school. The reality was far more complex. Tell me about your mother's condition, he said, his voice softening unexpectedly. Early onset Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed 3 years ago, just after my father left us. The bills. Sarah's voice cracked slightly, but she maintained her composure. The bills are overwhelming, but she's all I have left. I won't abandon her. Alexander stood abruptly, walking to the window. The campus sprawled before him, students rushing between classes, their biggest worry probably the next exam or paper. He thought about his own mother, gone for 15 years now, and how he'd been too busy building his career to spend her final years with her. What if, he said slowly, still facing the window, we could arrange something more flexible? Keep your hospital position for the insurance, but replace the other jobs with this research role. We could adjust the schedule accordingly. Sarah's reflection in the window showed surprise. You'd be willing to do that? Work around my other commitments? He turned back to face her. Miss Chen, exceptional minds deserve exceptional accommodations. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I have a feeling this research will benefit from your unique perspective on healthcare and family dynamics. The relief on Sarah's face was palpable, but she quickly composed herself. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, but I need to be clear about something else too. If we do this, I want to be treated like any other research assistant. No special treatment beyond the scheduling accommodation. Agreed, though I should warn you, I'm known for being particularly demanding of my research assistants. The fact that you're not a traditional student won't earn you any leniency. I wouldn't want it to, she replied with unexpected fierceness. I've worked too hard to be seen as a charity case. As they discussed the details of her schedule and research responsibilities, Alexander found himself increasingly intrigued by Sarah's mind. She had a way of approaching problems from angles he'd never considered, challenging assumptions he didn't even realize he held. Their discussion was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Without waiting for a response, Dr. Regina Blackwood, head of the psychology department, strode in. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer suit projected an aura of authority that usually impressed everyone she encountered. She stopped short at the sight of Sarah. Alexander, I need to speak with you about this unusual arrangement you're proposing. Her tone made it clear exactly what she thought of the situation. Perhaps your guest could give us a moment? Sarah rose quickly, gathering her things. Of course. Dr. Mitchell, shall we continue this discussion tomorrow? Alexander nodded, noting the way Regina's eyes narrowed at Sarah's worn blazer and scuffed shoes as she left the office. As soon as the door closed, Regina turned to him, her disapproval evident. Have you lost your mind, Alexander, offering a research position to an unqualified community audit student? The board will never approve this. She's brilliant, Regina. Her ideas about cognitive restructuring could revolutionize our approach to trauma treatment. She's a liability, Regina countered sharply. This department has a reputation to maintain. We can't just open our doors to every clever charity case that catches your eye. What's really going on here, Alexander? This isn't like you at all. The question caught him off guard. What was it about Sarah Chen that had prompted him to break so many of his own rules? He'd built his career on careful, methodical research and adherence to academic protocol. Yet something about her perspective, her determination in the face of overwhelming odds, had sparked something in him he thought long dormant, genuine intellectual excitement. I'm not asking for charity, Regina. I'm asking for innovation. When was the last time you heard truly original thinking in this department? We're becoming stagnant, recycling the same ideas with fancier terminology. Sarah Chen might not have the right pedigree, but she has something we desperately need, a fresh perspective, unconstrained by academic orthodoxy. Regina's expression softened slightly. You always were the idealist beneath that stern exterior, weren't you? But the board won't see it that way. They'll say you're compromising our standards, and there's already talk. Talk? What kind of talk? About your interest in this girl. You have to admit, it looks questionable. A distinguished professor suddenly breaking protocol for a young, attractive student? Alexander felt his face flush with anger. That's absurd. This is purely academic. Is it? Regina raised an eyebrow. Because I've known you for 20 years, Alexander, and I've never seen you fight this hard for anyone. Just, be careful. Your reputation isn't the only thing at stake here. After Regina left, Alexander sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the contract he'd prepared for Sarah. Regina's words had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Was there something more to his interest in Sarah's potential? No, he decided firmly. This was about academic integrity, about nurturing genuine talent regardless of its source. But as he looked out his window and saw Sarah crossing the quad below, her worn notebook clutched to her chest as she hurried to what was probably another exhausting shift at one of her jobs, he felt that same strange stirring in his chest. She was brilliant, determined, and completely unaware of how she was already beginning to transform his carefully ordered world. What Alexander couldn't know was that this was just the beginning. The waves of change that Sarah Chen would bring to his life and to the entire department were only starting to ripple outward, and soon they would become a tide that would sweep away everything he thought he knew about academia, about class barriers, and about his own heart. Did this part of the story move you? Hit like and subscribe to not miss any of our soul-stirring stories. The following weeks transformed Alexander's research lab into a hive of unprecedented activity. Sarah's presence had catalyzed something new, a fusion of theoretical rigor and practical innovation that was beginning to yield remarkable results. Their work on cognitive restructuring was advancing faster than he'd ever imagined possible, but it wasn't without its complications. One evening, as autumn's early darkness settled over the campus, Alexander found himself still in the lab with Sarah, surrounded by data printouts and coffee cups. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, but he barely noticed the hour. They'd been analyzing patient response patterns, and Sarah's insights were proving invaluable. "Look at this cluster," she said, pointing to a graph. "These patients all showed resistance to traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, but their responses to emotional regulation exercises were remarkably consistent. What if we're looking at a subset of trauma responses that current literature hasn't properly classified?" Alexander leaned closer, their shoulders almost touching as they examined the data. The proximity sent an unexpected jolt through him, which he quickly suppressed. "You might be onto something. This could explain why certain treatment protocols fail with seemingly promising candidates." Sarah's eyes lit up with that now familiar intellectual fire. "Exactly. And if we cross-reference this with the neurological mapping data from Dr. Wong's study," the lab door opened abruptly, cutting her off. Regina Blackwood stood in the doorway, her expression dark. "Alexander, a word? Now." He followed Regina into the hallway, noting her unusual tension. She waited until they were well out of Sarah's earshot before speaking. "The board meeting didn't go well," she said quietly. "They're questioning the validity of your research methods, particularly your decision to rely so heavily on an unqualified assistant." "Unqualified?" Alexander felt his anger rising. Sarah's contributions have been extraordinary. The data speaks for itself. It's not just about the data. Regina handed him a folder. This came across my desk this morning. I thought you should see it before anyone else does. Alexander opened the folder and felt his blood run cold. Inside was a decade-old newspaper article featuring a familiar face, Sarah's father. The headline read, "Research Fraud Rocks Medical Community. Dr. James Chen's breakthrough study revealed as fabrication." Her father, Alexander whispered, was one of the biggest research frauds in recent medical history, Regina finished. He didn't just leave his family 3 years ago. He fled to avoid prosecution after his falsified research on Alzheimer's treatment was exposed. The scandal nearly destroyed 3 major research institutions. Alexander's mind raced. Sarah had never mentioned her father's profession, let alone his disgrace. The timing of his departure coincided with her mother's diagnosis, but suddenly the story took on a different dimension. "Does she know?" Regina asked gently. I don't know." Alexander stared at the article, his thoughts in turmoil. "But this doesn't change the quality of her work. We've verified every result, every data point. The board won't see it that way. They're already suspicious of her unconventional background. If this gets out, it could destroy not just her career prospects, but yours as well. Everything you've built, Alexander." He closed the folder with trembling hands. "I need time to think about this." "You don't have much time. The board meets again next week to review your research funding. They're going to want answers about your methods, your data, and your choice of assistant." After Regina left, Alexander stood in the hallway for a long moment, the folder heavy in his hands. Through the lab window, he could see Sarah still working, completely unaware of the storm gathering around her. The sight of her dedication made his chest ache. When he returned to the lab, Sarah looked up with a smile that faded as she saw his expression. "Is everything all right, Dr. Mitchell?" He sat down heavily in his chair. "Sarah, we need to talk about your father." The color drained from her face. She sat perfectly still, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "What about him?" "I know about the research fraud scandal." "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's breathing became shallow, but she maintained her composure. "Because I wanted to be judged on my own merits, not my father's mistakes. Everything I've done here, every theory, every data point has been absolutely honest. I would never—" "I know," Alexander interrupted softly. "I know you wouldn't. But the board is questioning our research, and this connection to your father's scandal could be devastating." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the small lab. "So that's why you really offered me this position? To keep an eye on me, to make sure I wasn't following in my father's footsteps?" "No! I had no idea about any of this until today. I offered you the position because I saw genuine brilliance in your work." She stopped pacing, turning to face him with tears in her eyes. "Do you know what it's like, Dr. Mitchell? To watch your father destroy everything your family built? To see your mother's health deteriorate while he disappeared with another woman and all our savings? I was 17 when it happened. 17 when I had to become both daughter and caregiver. When I had to learn how to balance checkbooks and insurance claims while my classmates were preparing for prom." Alexander felt his heart breaking for her. He stood, taking a step toward her, but she backed away. "My father's research was meant to help people like my mother. When it was exposed as fraud, it didn't just ruin his career. It destroyed the hope of thousands of families waiting for a breakthrough. That's why I work so hard, why I'm so careful with every piece of data we process. I need to prove that real research, honest research, can still make a difference." The passion in her voice, the pain and determination in her eyes, stirred something deep within Alexander. Before he could stop himself, he reached out and took her hand. "Sarah, listen to me. You are not your father. Your work here has been impeccable, revolutionary even. We'll fight this together." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. Something electric passed between them, a current of understanding and connection that transcended their professional relationship. For a moment, Neither of them moved. Then Sarah gently withdrew her hand. "We can't," she whispered. Whatever this is, it would only give them more ammunition against us. The research has to come first." Alexander stepped back, reality crashing back in. She was right, of course. Any hint of impropriety between them would destroy everything they'd worked for. But the moment had shifted something fundamental between them, revealing feelings that couldn't be easily dismissed. "We should get back to work," Sarah said, her voice steadier now. "The board meeting is next week, and we need our results to be undeniable." As they returned to their data analysis, both pretending that nothing had changed, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something dangerous. The research that had brought them together now seemed to be drawing them into deeper waters, where professional ambition, personal ethics, and unexpected emotions swirled together in a potentially devastating combination. What neither of them realized was that the true test of their relationship, both professional and personal, was yet to come. The secrets of Sarah's past were not fully revealed, and the choices they would both face would challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, redemption, and the price of academic integrity. The deepest secrets are about to be revealed. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter of this thrilling story. The morning of the board meeting dawned cold and grey, with a bitter wind whipping across Harvard's campus. Alexander stood at his office window, watching early snowflakes dance in the air, his reflection in the glass showing a man he barely recognized. The past week had aged him, dark circles under his eyes, testament to sleepless nights spent reviewing their research data. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "Emergency at the hospital. Mom had a bad episode, can't make the board meeting. I'm so sorry." Alexander's heart sank. They'd planned to present their findings together, her passion for the research complementing his academic authority. Now he would face the board alone, defending not just their work, but her reputation as well. The boardroom felt colder than usual as Alexander took his seat facing the assembled members. Regina sat among them, her expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of their collective judgment before anyone spoke a word. "Dr. Mitchell," Dean Harrison began, his voice carrying the gravitas of his 40 years at Harvard, "we've reviewed the preliminary findings of your research with Miss Chen. While the results are interesting, serious concerns have been raised about your methodology and your choice of research assistant." Alexander straightened in his chair. "Our methodology is sound, and Miss Chen's contributions have been invaluable. The data speaks for itself." "Does it?" Professor Walsh, a longtime rival, leaned forward. "Just as her father's data spoke for itself before it was revealed as fraudulent. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." "Alexander, Sarah Chen is not her father," Alexander responded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Every piece of our research has been meticulously documented and verified." "That's not the only concern," Dean Harrison interjected. "There have been observations about the nature of your relationship with Miss Chen. Late nights in the lab, private meetings, unusual accommodations made for her schedule. It raises questions about objectivity and professional boundaries." Alexander felt his face flush. "Those accusations are completely unfounded. Our relationship is strictly professional." "Is it?" Regina spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Alexander, I've known you for years. I've never seen you fight this hard for anyone. Are you certain your judgment hasn't been compromised?" Before he could respond, the boardroom door opened. Sarah stood there, slightly breathless, her clothes disheveled from rushing. "I apologize for being late." "My mother." "Miss Chen," Dean Harrison cut her off. "This is a closed board meeting." "With respect, sir," Sarah said, stepping into the room. "You're discussing my research and my integrity. I believe I have a right to defend both." A murmur ran through the board members. Alexander felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride at her courage, fear at what this bold move might cost them both. "Very well," Dean Harrison conceded. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why we should continue funding research led by someone with your family history." Sarah walked to the front of the room, her step steady despite the tremor Alexander could see in her hands. My father's actions taught me the most valuable lesson a researcher can learn, that integrity isn't just about following protocols, it's about serving truth above all else. Every day I work to restore what he destroyed. Trust in the scientific process. She pulled out her worn notebook, opening it to reveal pages of meticulous notes. They document everything, every observation, every data point, every variable. Not just because it's good science, but because I understand better than most the cost of dishonesty in research. My mother's condition worsens every day, partly because people like my father gave false hope to families desperate for treatment. The room fell silent. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. I'm not asking you to trust me because of my name. God knows that would be foolish. I'm asking you to examine our work on its merits. Dr. Mitchell didn't choose me because of my background or despite it. He chose me because I saw patterns others missed, because I understood firsthand how crucial honest research is to real people suffering real pain. Alexander watched in amazement as Sarah proceeded to walk the board through their findings, explaining complex concepts with a clarity born of deep understanding. She showed how their research was building on proven methodologies while breaking new ground in treatment approaches. And yes, she concluded, I work 3 jobs to support my mother. I'm not a traditional researcher with a prestigious degree, but perhaps that's exactly why our work is yielding results, because I bring a perspective shaped by real-world experience, not just academic theory. The silence that followed was profound. Alexander stood, moving to stand beside her. Everything Miss Chen has said is true. If the board has concerns about our research, I invite the most rigorous review possible. But if you're questioning her integrity based on her father's actions or her background, then perhaps it's not our ethics that need examination. Dean Harrison cleared his throat. This is highly irregular. So was Watson and Crick's approach to DNA research, Alexander interrupted. So was Einstein's work as a patent clerk. Innovation rarely comes from following conventional paths. Suddenly, the boardroom door burst open again. A nurse from the hospital where Sarah worked part-time rushed in. Miss Chen, your mother, there's been an incident. You need to come quickly. The color drained from Sarah's face. She looked at Alexander, torn between her presentation and her family obligation. Go, he said softly. I'll handle things here. Sarah grabbed her bag and rushed out, leaving Alexander facing the board alone again. But this time, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. He could see thoughtful expressions replacing skeptical ones, particularly on Regina's face. She's quite remarkable, Regina said quietly. Yes, Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. She is. The next few hours were a blur of technical questions and bureaucratic discussions, but Alexander barely registered them. His mind was with Sarah at the hospital, wondering what crisis she was facing alone. When the meeting finally ended, he had no clear sense of which way the board was leaning. Regina caught up with him in the hallway. Alexander, wait. There's something you should know before you go after her. He turned, bracing for more bad news. The board, they're not just concerned about her father's scandal. They've received an anonymous tip suggesting that Sarah might have had knowledge of her father's fraud before it was exposed. That she might have been involved in covering it up initially. Alexander felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. That's impossible. She was just a teenager when it happened. A teenager who worked as her father's research assistant during summers, Regina replied gently. The tip included documentation, emails, notes. They're circumstantial, but why are you telling me this now? Because I see how you look at her, Alexander. And because if these allegations have any truth to them, your career won't be the only casualty. The entire department could be implicated. Alexander stood frozen in the hallway, his mind racing. Everything he thought he knew about Sarah seemed suddenly uncertain. The passion she brought to their research, her insistence on meticulous documentation, was it truly about integrity or about covering her tracks? But even as doubt crept in, he remembered the look in her eyes when she spoke about her mother, the genuine pain when she discussed her father's betrayal. Either she was the most skilled manipulator he'd ever met, or she was exactly what she appeared to be, a brilliant young woman trying to redeem herself from a legacy she never chose. As he rushed toward his car, determined to find Sarah and get the truth, Alexander realized that more than their research was at stake now. He had fallen in love with Sarah Chen, not just her brilliant mind, but her resilience, her complexity, her unflagging determination to do what was right. The thought that she might have been lying all along was almost unbearable. What he didn't know was that Sarah was facing her own crisis at the hospital, one that would force both of them to confront truths they'd been avoiding and make decisions that would alter the course of their lives forever. True love always finds its way. If this story is touching your heart, show it with a like and by sharing in the comments. The hospital corridors seemed endless as Alexander rushed through them, his footsteps echoing off sterile walls. He found Sarah in the neurological ward, sitting outside her mother's room, her face buried in her hands. The sight stopped him in his tracks. She looked so young, so vulnerable. "Sarah," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes red but dry. "Dr. Mitchell, what are you doing here? I needed to find you. There are things we need to discuss." He paused, glancing at the closed hospital room door. "How is she?" "Stable now," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. "It was a severe episode. The doctors say she's declining faster than expected. The experimental treatment isn't working." Alexander sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Were you involved in your father's research fraud?" She stiffened, turning to face him fully. "What?" "The board received documentation suggesting you might have known about the falsified data, that you might have helped cover it up initially." Sarah's laugh was bitter, startling in its intensity. Of course they would find that." She stood, pacing the narrow hallway. "Would you like to know what I actually did? What my great crime was?" Alexander waited, his heart pounding. "I was 16, working in my father's lab during summer break. I noticed discrepancies in some of the patient response data. When I brought it to his attention, he told me I must have made a mistake in the entry process. He was my father, the brilliant Dr. James Chen. Who was I to question him?" She stopped pacing, leaning against the wall. "But the discrepancies kept appearing. I started keeping my own notes, trying to understand what I was seeing. When I finally confronted him with evidence that couldn't be explained away, She closed her eyes, fighting for composure. "He told me that sometimes science needed a little help to reach the right conclusions, that the treatment would work eventually. We just needed more time and funding to perfect it." "What did you do?" Alexander asked quietly. "I was 17 by then. I threatened to report him myself if he didn't come clean. That's when he ran, took his research money and his mistress, and disappeared." She opened her eyes, meeting Alexander's gaze directly. "Those emails they found, that documentation, it's probably my notes from that time, my attempts to understand what was happening. I never helped him cover anything up. I was just a teenager trying to believe in her father until I couldn't anymore." Alexander stood, crossing the space between them. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I was ashamed, not just of him, but of myself. I should have seen it sooner, should have done more to stop him. Instead, families like ours kept hoping for a cure that would never come." She glanced at her mother's room. "I chose this hospital for my part-time job so I could be close to her, but also because I needed to understand the real impact of research fraud. Every patient here reminds me why integrity matters." Suddenly, a commotion from inside the room drew their attention. Mrs. Chen was having another episode. They rushed in to find her agitated, trying to get out of bed. "Mum, it's okay," Sarah said, hurrying to her side. "I'm here." Mrs. Chen looked at her daughter with momentary clarity. "Sarah, the numbers, they don't match. Your father's numbers never matched." Alexander watched as Sarah gently calmed her mother, speaking softly until the agitation passed. In that moment, seeing them together, everything became clear to him. After Mrs. Chen settled back into sleep, they stepped out into the hallway again. Alexander took Sarah's hands in his, professional boundaries finally crumbling. "I believe you," he said simply, "not just about your father, but about everything. Your dedication to our research, your integrity, it's all genuine. And I think I understand now why you push yourself so hard." Sarah looked down at their joined hands. "The board won't see it that way. They'll use my father's scandal and these old documents to discredit our research. Let them try." Alexander's voice was firm. "Because I'm not just going to defend our research. I'm going to tell them the full story about a 17-year-old girl who chose truth over family loyalty, about a brilliant researcher who works 3 jobs to care for her mother while pursuing groundbreaking work, about someone who understands the human cost of scientific fraud better than anyone." Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "Why would you risk your career for me?" "Because you've taught me something I'd forgotten in all my years in academia, that real innovation comes from understanding the human heart as well as the human mind. Our research isn't just about cognitive restructuring techniques. It's about helping real people heal from real trauma. You taught me that." He cupped her face gently, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "And because somewhere between analyzing data and watching you fight for what's right, I fell in love with you." Sarah's breath caught. "We can't, the board needs to decide what matters more, protecting their reputation or advancing genuine research that could help thousands. As for us," he smiled softly, "I'm not your professor anymore, Sarah. I'm your research partner. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be more." Before she could respond, Regina appeared at the end of the hallway. "Alexander, the board has reached a decision." They turned to face her, still holding hands. Regina's eyes flickered to their joined hands, then back to their faces. To their surprise, she smiled. "They've approved continued funding for your research, with conditions." "What conditions?" Sarah asked warily. "Full transparency about your background, including your role in exposing your father's fraud. They want you to work with the ethics committee to develop new protocols for research verification, and—" Regina's smile widened slightly. "They've offered you a full scholarship to complete your PhD here. Miss Chen, it seems your presentation impressed more than a few members." Sarah swayed slightly, overwhelmed. Alexander steadied her, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "There's more," Regina continued. "The hospital's research department is interested in implementing your cognitive restructuring protocols in their neurology ward. They think it might help patients like your mother cope better with their conditions." "My mother?" Sarah turned to look through the window at Mrs. Chen's sleeping form. "The treatment might not cure her," Alexander said gently, "but it could help her have more good days. And more importantly, it could help countless other families facing similar struggles." Sarah turned back to them, straightening her shoulders. "When do we start?" 1 year later, the lecture hall was packed as Sarah concluded her presentation on their refined treatment protocols. Alexander watched from the back, pride swelling in his chest. The past year had transformed them both. Their research had evolved into something neither of them could have achieved alone, combining his theoretical expertise with her practical insights. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, having one of her good days. The new protocols hadn't cured her, but they'd helped stabilize her condition, giving her more moments of clarity. She beamed at her daughter, and Alexander saw echoes of Sarah's strength in her smile. After the applause died down and the hall emptied, Sarah joined him at the back of the room. "Ready to go home?" she asked, sliding her hand into his. "Almost," he replied, pulling her close. "First, I have a question for you." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Sarah's eyes widened. "Alexander, you taught me that the greatest discoveries come from being brave enough to question everything we think we know," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Will you keep discovering with me for the rest of our lives?" Sarah's answer was a kiss that held all the passion, integrity, and love that had brought them to this moment. As they left the lecture hall hand in hand, both knew that their greatest research project was just beginning, the lifelong study of love, trust, and the courage to believe in second chances. Their story would be whispered in university halls for years to come, not just as a tale of academic achievement, but as proof that the heart's hypothesis could sometimes be the most accurate of all. The brilliant professor who learned to question his own prejudices and the determined young woman who proved that integrity was the greatest inheritance of all had found in each other something more valuable than any research breakthrough. The truth of love itself. What would you have done in Sarah's place when she discovered the truth about her father? Do you think love between Sarah and Alexander would have blossomed if she had been a traditional student? If this story made you feel, show it with a like. Subscribe now. Your support allows us to keep sharing heart-touching stories every day.